Hi everybody, and welcome back to a second installment of my critiques of creation science. And once again, just to reiterate, the reason I'm putting these videos out here, right? The reason I'm creating this series, I don't know how many videos it'll turn into. It could be just a few, could be a dozen, I don't know. But is not to fuel any sort of science versus religion debate, okay? Personally, I don't buy into that particular line of reasoning, okay? I don't like debating religion, right? What I am trying to do with these videos is to illuminate the flaws scientifically of the underlying assumptions within much of the creation movement. And the reason is simply to enhance science education. Okay. Religiously, I have no problems with anybody being religious. I'm religious myself. And so this is not meant to be an attack on religion. So if you're watching this and you feel like what I'm saying is attacking your belief system, then note that that is not the intent. Okay, that is not what I'm intending to do. My goals here are simply and only to talk about the flaws scientifically, and I will talk about some theology even in this video. We'll get into where I stand on certain things and why I stand there, but this is not to degrade anybody's belief systems or try and prove anybody wrong. This is simply to communicate science education and how to think scientifically and evaluate things scientifically. And one of the things to note is that scientific reasoning and logical reasoning go hand in hand very often, right? Now, of course, you can do philosophy without science, but you cannot do science without philosophy. If you want to construct hypotheses and theories according to the scientific method, then there's an inherent level of logical soundness built into those steps, right? So, without further ado, let's dive back into the video that I had critiqued in the first video. And again, this is a debate between Kent Hovind and three professors from Embry Riddle University. And I apologize, I'm not really giving much time to the professors. And that's simply because this debate is, as you can see, well over 2 hours long. And if I gave time to the entire thing, this would turn into 20 videos by itself very easily, right? I made a 2 hour video just based on Kent's, first 10-minute kind of introduction. And so, because the creation side is what I am seeking to address, then that is what we're going to focus on. We're going to jump in the video right as one of the trio of professors had asked Kent, where did God come from? And this stemmed from Kent's insistence on questioning where and how and what started the Big Bang. So they kind of turned the question on him and asked him about God, and this is his reply.
Go ahead.
All right, your question, where did God come from, assumes that you're thinking of the wrong, obviously it displays that you're thinking of the wrong God, because the God of the Bible is not affected by time, space, or matter. If he's affected by time, space, or matter, he's not God. Time, space, and matter is what we call a continuum. All of them.
I theologically agree with that statement. If God is God, then he must be at least able, whether he does or not, but he must be able to exist outside his creation. Um, and perhaps out of fairness, and if anybody feels like this is too politically correct, then um, that's you're entitled to how you feel. But perhaps I should start to refer generically when we're talking about God as they, um, and not necessarily they in the plural sense, but they in the um, not necessarily he or she sense, since we don't really know. Of course, the Bible refers to God as a he, but if we're talking about God in general, then I don't know that we should assign he or she, but in any case, so if God created the universe, then they need to definitely be able to exist outside of it, just as whoever builds computers doesn't exist inside the computer games that you can write and play in a computer. But also at the same time, as we'll see, his argument actually has a fairly deep flaw, and we'll point that out here in just a moment.
Them have to come into existence at the same instant. Because if there were matter but no space, where would you put it? If there were matter and space but no time, when would you put it? You cannot have time, space, or matter independently. They have to come into existence simultaneously. The Bible answers that in 10 words. In the beginning, there's time. God created the heaven, there's space, and the earth, there's matter. So you have time, space, matter, created a trinity of trinities there. Just, time is past, present, future. Space has length, width, height. Matter has solid, liquid, gas. You have a trinity of trinities created instantaneously, and the God who created them has to be outside of them. If he's limited by time, he's not God. The guy who created this computer is not in the computer. He's not running around in there changing the numbers on the screen, okay? The God who created this universe is outside of the universe. He's above it, beyond it, in it, through it. He's unaffected by it. So the concept that a spiritual force cannot have any effect on a material body, well then I guess you'd have to explain to me things like emotions and love and hatred and envy and jealousy and rationality. I mean, if your brain is just a random collection of chemicals that formed by chance over billions of years, how on earth can you trust your own reasoning processes and the thoughts that you think? Okay, so your question, where did God come from, is assuming a limited God. And that's your problem. The God that I worship is not limited by time, space, or matter. If I could fit the infinite God in my 3-pound brain, he would not be worth worshiping, that's for certain. So that's the God that I worship. Thank you.
So notice that was a very long-winded way of not answering the question. The question was, where did God come from? Not what are God's characteristics. And this is classic deflection for experienced debaters. They will often try to slightly deflect and give an answer that sounds like they're answering the question without answering the question. And that's exactly what happened here. The intellectually honest answer, where did God come from, is we don't know. Just as we don't know where the Big Bang came from or what caused it. And so not knowing where God came from or comes from doesn't in any way necessarily have to diminish your faith. It's not hard conceptually to think of a being existing or beings existing in either higher dimensions within our own universe or outside of our universe completely. And if there are entities advanced enough to create universes, which is not a hard thing to conceive of, at least in principle, then it would be very rational for anything that they created that achieved consciousness to the point of self-awareness to ask where they themselves came from first, and then if they were created and realized they were created, where did their creator come from? And to me, that's a very intellectually honest question. And even if the answer is we don't know, then that's the answer, and that's perfectly fine. And again, especially since this is a scientific debate, then that is the answer. We don't know, and in science, we don't appeal to things outside of nature. And so when you talk about God existing outside of our physical realm, then that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But not answering the question is a little bit odd. And also, what he answered is a bit of a logical tautology, right? It's almost circular reasoning. God must be infinite or else he wouldn't be worth worshiping. That's a perfectly fine theological statement, but it's not a very sound logical statement, because you don't have any real support for any of your premises. It's like, I'm going to believe something because I want to believe something, therefore it must be true. It's not a logically sound statement. So he has a tautology in there. He doesn't answer or address the question. And so I would say that particular aspect of the interaction between Hovind and the professors. Again, Hovind has a little bit of charisma, and he's well spoken. He's done this debate with different people several times, so he's got all of his talking points down, and he's very comfortable with them, which is why he's able to rapid fire a lot of points. But at the end of the day, they're really not saying anything. The next clip is going to come at this point here. And here he's going to critique a little bit more specifically about the Big Bang Theory.
There are so many thousands of unanswered questions. See, it's much easier for me to believe in the beginning God than to believe in the beginning dirt or matter. The evolutionist does not answer the question. There's 6 different types of evolution, as I shared clearly earlier. If the Big Bang Theory is true, then I would like to know what exploded and where did it come from and where did the energy come from and where did...
Okay, notice what he did here. He says, if the Big Bang is true, then where did the energy, where did the matter, where did the space come from, what exploded? But he didn't answer the exact same question that was posed to him, right? If you believe in God, where did God come from? If you're going to ask one, then it is an absolutely fair statement to ask the other. So it is a good question. But I'll make a more general comment about this pervasive sentiment within the creationist movement here in just a second.
Where did the space come from for the matter to expand into, and where did the organization come from, and where did the information come from? There's a whole host of questions that are a whole lot harder for you to answer than in the beginning God. Where?
Okay, so these are fair questions, right? Where did matter come from? Where did space-time come from? What caused the Big Bang? And all of this, line of reasoning. And the answer is we don't know. Okay, the answer is we simply do not know why the universe came into existence. We have some speculation, but at this point, that's all it is speculation. However, I would raise a few points here, and that is this. or these are, and in no particular order. Hovind is attempting to discredit the Big Bang Theory because it is limited, right? Because of its limitations. However, every physical theory, every physical model that we use in science is limited in some way, shape, or form. That's the nature of theories. That's why we don't have an all-inclusive theory of everything yet. And so that in and of itself is not a valid reason to, I'm going to use some colloquial language, throw shade on the theory or concept or model or idea. They're valid questions, okay? It is valid to ask where things came from. It is not valid to then use that lack of current knowledge to attempt to discredit the theory when all theories are limited. And furthermore, these are questions the Big Bang does not actually address, okay? When it was first presented in its initial form by Abbe Lemaitre, there was no attempt to discern or divine where it came from, why it happened, or where the energy content was drawn from to then produce what we see. We simply don't know. And the theory never attempted to address this. So again, as I mentioned in the previous video, what he's stating here is like complaining that a crime novel is not a car manual. You want to fix your car, and so you wish you had a car manual, but what you have in your backpack is a crime novel, and you're upset that your crime novel isn't telling you how to fix your V6 engine. That's exactly what this is like. Again, the questions themselves are valid. We ask these questions all the time. It is not valid to attempt to use the lack of knowledge about them to discredit the theory when the theory never addresses these things in the first place, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, okay, going back to the idea that all models and all theories are limited in some way, okay. There's a big difference, a very big difference between knowing nothing and not knowing everything. People who want to use the line of reasoning, well, you can't answer these questions, therefore how do you know you're right? What they're really saying is, since we don't know everything, how can you know anything? Now, that is also, once again, a valid question, but we have answers to those questions. And in the scientific way of thinking, the answer is, what model or models are you appealing to that have the best descriptive power and the most observational evidence to back them up? Creation science is very ad hoc in that it picks and chooses what it says. There's another debate, and I might critique this one as well, but there's another debate where Hovind claims that he would predict the cosmic redshift based on the passage where, I forget where it is, but where the Bible says he stretched the heavens, right? And so Hovind claims he would, think of that as the heavens being stretched, and you would interpret that as seeing a redshift. But First things first, I would ask, okay, the word stretched is past tense. You could just as well argue that that means that the heavens were stretched and now have stopped stretching. And that's why you see the stars more or less fixed in the night sky. So it's almost like having a one size fits all tool that you can just arbitrarily fit into any hole you wish. The problem with creation science, or another problem I should say, is that a lot of it is cherry picking. So they will say, okay, well, I would predict the redshift. Okay, would you also predict the ratio of helium to hydrogen in the early universe and what we observe in the oldest stars? Would you predict Hubble's law? You can predict something is redshifted, or that the universe is expanding because he stretched the heavens. But would you predict precisely the Hubble law? Would you predict the black body radiation nature of the Big Bang, of the cosmic background? Would you predict the temperature of space? So when creationists say, we have a model for something, it's usually very ad hoc. And for example, here we've got a creation scientist, Dr. Russell Humphreys, and he wrote this paper back in the 1980s, and he was predicting the magnetic fields of the planets from a creation model, and he was trying to um, get an agreement with his creation model with observed magnetic fields that we see, particularly from space probes that we have sent to the different planets. And so my question would be, okay, so you have this model that predicts the magnetic fields of these planets, but does the Bible tell us where magnetism comes from? Can the Bible give us Ampere's law? And can it give us Faraday's law that tell us the equivalency between electric fields and magnetic fields, how they can generate each other, and that magnetic fields are observed from moving charges? Does the Bible give us what magnetism is? So again, this is somewhat cherry picking in that, the Bible may be able to, or just the assumption of creation. And when I use that term, we're using it in the creation science sense, literal 24-hour days, the universe is 6,000 years old, etc. If you use those assumptions, do they tell you what magnetism is? Right? Maxwell's equations give us a description for where magnetism comes from at some level. Okay, to really truly understand magnetism, you actually have to dive into relativity. But you, I can't see how the assumption of 6,000 years and 24-hour literal days gives you that information, gives you Einstein's theory of special relativity, how it gives you Maxwell's equations, how it predicts the relationship between the speed of light and the electric and magnetic constants in terms of the permittivity of free space and the permeability of free space. So I don't know, how to accept that the model is a good one to start with, because it's very ad hoc. You can pick and choose, and you can obviously manipulate verbiage in Scripture to agree with a myriad of interpretations. And I've already pointed one out. He stretched the heavens. Okay, does that mean they're still stretching? Or does that mean that he stretched and stopped? Because one is going to give you a red shift and one is not, but you're using the exact same passage and same verbiage, just with a different interpretation. And a example that I would draw from talking about theories and models being incomplete. Not only is the Big Bang incomplete, right? It doesn't say where the universe came from. And astronomers recognize that as a limitation. There's nothing wrong with that. Evolution is incomplete in that it doesn't predict where life came from. I would pose, okay, a few more. We still don't know what electric charge is. Physicists don't know what charge is. We simply know that there is a property that some particles possess. We've labeled that electric charge, and we can use it. We know how to describe it, and we know how to exploit it for technology. We know how it's going to behave. Either that, or it's a very giant coincidence that all of our technology works, right? Pretty much every piece of technology that you can plug in or uses batteries, any piece of technology that uses electric power in any shape, any way, shape, or form, is built on the idea of moving electric charges producing current. And so it's either a ginormous coincidence that our things work, right? Computers work, TVs work, cell phones work, satellites work, the spaceship worked. I should say the Apollo missions going to the moon worked. None of this would work if electricity and magnetism didn't behave according to Maxwell's equations. So either we know about electricity, even if we don't know what charge is, that doesn't mean we can't manipulate it. That doesn't mean we can't use it in meaningful ways. So again, not knowing everything is different than knowing nothing, right? We don't know what electric charge is, but we can sure build computers. And so, I would urge very thoughtfully for people to think through what it is a scientific idea is claiming to say. And when somebody says their idea is scientific, ask them not only what is your idea attempting to address, but what are the limitations of your idea. And on top of that, I would also urge folks to not fall into what is known as the God of the Gaps Fallacy. And the God of the Gaps Fallacy is a fairly popular framework that many people fall into. And the basic reasoning behind it goes like this. There's something I don't know in nature how it works. Therefore, God must be in charge, or does it, or maintains it, or whatever. And a classic example would be the planets. Before Newton's universal law of gravitation was discovered, pretty much everybody from most different cultures, whatever their religious deity or deities were, they ascribed some sense of the heavens moving in the ordered ways that it does according to those gods. And in the early Renaissance, before thinkers like Kepler and Galileo and Newton got a hold of observable astronomy with the telescope and with the invention of theoretical mechanics with Newton's Principia Mathematica. The order in the motion of the heavens between the stars and the planets was largely attributed to God. God is what keeps the heavens in motion. God is what keeps the heavens ordered. God is the clock keeper or the watchmaker who set it all in motion. Once Newton's universal law of gravitation came about, we didn't need God to explain why the planets were able to stay in stable orbits. And so the frontier of where God was got pushed back. And so the God of the gaps, essentially, as a philosophical idea, is as our understanding of the natural world increases, the places where God can exist, if that's where you're going to put him, get smaller and smaller and smaller. Before, when astronomers believed the universe was eternal, in the 17 and 1800s, it was very, very popular idea that the universe had always existed. And that's where a lot of people put God. He created the universe and he was infinite, so he could make an infinite universe. There's no problem with that. But then we discovered the universe had a beginning. And a lot of it's a little ironic that the modern creationist movement is so against the Big Bang Theory when at the time it was proposed, many scientists hated it because it implied a beginning. It seemed to imply with Genesis chapter 1. And it was largely disliked by a number of people. And in fact, the term Big Bang was a pejorative term that just kind of stuck. And so as science increases in knowledge and our gaps start to dwindle, initially it was the heavens that we see, right? When you walk outside at night and you see the stars and the planets move, God is what kept that in motion. But then we learned about Newton's universal law of gravity. We learned about orbits. We learned that the Earth was in orbit. We learned that it was spinning on its own axis. And so we didn't need God anymore to understand why the stars change with the seasons. Understanding his universal law of gravity allowed us to understand how gravity affects orbits and how gravity causes orbits. And so God was no longer necessary to keep the solar system in perfect motion, periodic motion. And God kept getting pushed further and further back along the scientific frontier to the point where he now sits for many people at the instant of creation. Well, at minimum, we don't know what created the universe, therefore God must have done it. And I'm not saying he hasn't done it. I'm not saying he didn't do it. What I am saying is that if history over the past 300 years is anything to go by, it is a rather poor bet to just simply keep God at the frontier of science and say that's where he, must exist. That's where miracles happen. Because the more we learn, the more likely it is that we will learn what those miracles are. And forgive me for just a moment, I forgot to turn my heat off. Don't necessarily want all that ambient noise. And so I personally find it a bad idea to, claim that the edge of our scientific knowledge is where God is. I personally take the view that science and religion don't have to be reconciled, right? And this is one of the major flaws I find with the creation way of thinking, is that they're continually trying to reconcile their views of Genesis, particularly their views of Genesis, with the scientific method. And before I get into my stances on Genesis and things like that, I'll say one more thing. And this is the main reason why creation science is not science. Okay? This is the main reason why creation science is not science. Creation investigators. Well, let me start with the scientific method. Okay, the scientific method says you make observations about the natural world, you form ideas about the way they behave based on those observations, you perform tests to test your ideas, and then you adjust your understanding based on those tests. I mentioned this in the last video, that scientists have to be willing to change their minds. If the evidence that you are evaluating does not agree with your preconceived ideas or what we thought we knew as far as theories or models go, and if enough irrefutable evidence, I shouldn't say irrefutable, if enough credible evidence mounts against that idea, you have to be willing to change your mind. So science is an open-ended book. We don't know the end of the story scientifically. We just simply can't say what is and what isn't going to come out of our research over the next few hundred, maybe thousands of years. We'd have no idea. We don't know what the end stories are. Creation science, on the other hand, starts with a conclusion and tries to then fit every piece of physical observation into that model. And that's simply not how science works. Science says, I start with observations, build models, test those models, and then adjust my understanding. Creation science, at the end of the day, says I have a conclusion that I want to prove, so I'm going to try and interpret and mold all of my data and all of my knowledge into this specific interpretation. And that is as counterproductive to the scientific method as any philosophical system out there. Okay, and that is why creation science is not science. Okay, you will rarely meet a creation scientist who, faced with a mountain of data, changed their mind away from a creation model that then had to be abandoned. But it's hard to do that, okay? And this kind of goes back to some of what was being talked about in the last video and a little bit in this video. There's enough ad hocness in the creation science framework where, okay, so you build a theory or a model based on what you perceive to be your fundamental assumptions. 6,000 years, 6 days, creation. And then if a test comes back that refutes it, there's so much ad hoc nature to creation science that it's not hard to then try and just kind of fudge your model a little bit and keep those underlying assumptions as valid. There's only one fundamental assumption in science. Okay, at the end of the day, there's only one fundamental assumption in science, and that is this: the scientific method is the best method that humanity to this point has developed with which to investigate the natural world. That's the only assumption in science at the end of the day. There are, you can have specific assumptions that relate to specific fields or to specific models and things, but across the board, encompassing all branches of science, that's really the only assumption that exists in the scientific realm, right? So when you try to build models where you already have the conclusion, but you're trying to fit, and I would even argue twist the data into a specific framework, you do harm to both the data, your ideas, and the legitimate scientific method. And that's what I'm passionate about. That is where my heart is, if you will. So, without further ado, let me share with you where I stand on these days of creation, right? How are the days of Genesis to be interpreted? So, admittedly, I am coming at this from a Judeo-Christian background. So, that is the religion, I guess, if you will, that I'll be addressing. But that's fair because, as far as I'm aware, most other religions around the world don't have the same fraction of people who practice their religion who adhere to fundamentalism as much as Christians do here in the United States, at least in the Western countries. I could be wrong about that. There could be just as many high fraction of fundamentalist Muslims in other countries who try to do the same thing with the Quran as creation scientists here in the West do with the Bible, but I'm not aware of it. If anybody has any information on that and wants to drop it in the comments, feel free. I'd be interested to learn more about what other religions have to say with creation, their stories, their teachings on creation, and whether other religions have this phenomenon where people try to use their religion as a framework for a scientific scientific model, right? But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few short passages from this book. And this book is Lange's Commentary on Genesis. John Peter Lange was a German theologian. And one point that should be made, right? This text, this commentary on Genesis, was written in 1864. So the topics of theology seeming to collide with science are not new. Okay, this is not a new phenomenon. This is not new arguments. Okay, and some people will try to convince you that the creation movement has only been around for a short period of time, less than 100 years. And it really depends on which variation of the creation movement you're in or talking about. But I want you to hear these words, whether you're a Christian or not. Okay, whether you're a Christian or not, I invite you to hear these words and at least think about what this means for this supposed conflict between religion and science. I claim that it is a contrived conflict, and creation science only actually seeks to bolster that conflict, because the more creation science is promulgated in our culture and people fight for it to be taught in schools and things like that, the more they actually damage their own cause, because many, not all, but many students, middle school, high school, college students, eventually realize that it's indoctrination. And Hovind will often talk about the religion of evolution and the religion of the Big Bang, and he insists that people who talk about these things and study them and accept them are believing in a religion. That's not true, okay? And here's why. Once again, scientists are bound to change their mind in the face of credible and mounting evidence. That is antithetical to how religion operates. And religion, in one sense, you could argue that religion is an accepted belief or set of beliefs that informs one's worldview, right? And it can encompass physical things, it can encompass metaphysical, philosophical, theological, moral, ethical issues, but it informs someone on their worldview. But usually most religions aren't open to change. Most religions are not. Now, and what I mean by that is, yes, the Christian religion has certainly evolved a great deal from what it was 2,000 years ago. But on small time scales, you will generally not see at least a given branch of a religion, such as the Southern Baptist Church, be open to changing some of what they believe are their core fundamental beliefs, among which is young earth creationism. You won't see them be open to changing what is in their manuals and tracts and things regarding issues of young earth creationism, and whatever other controversial thing is happening in society that you want to throw in there, right? Churches and religions simply don't change on those issues, at least over in the short term. And by short term, what I mean is usually a couple hundred years. There are some outliers to that, but in general, religion is not as easily and openly criticizable as scientific results are. And I may do a few videos on Ken Ham and his interactions with Bill Nye, both in the debate and then when Bill toured the Ark encounter. And that was one of the things that struck me when I was watching those videos, is the difference between a religion and a science, where scientists are forced to change their mind all the time on certain things, and at least the scientific community is forced to. Whereas religion is very opposed, and even if there are mechanisms to change ideas, they are usually very long, drawn-out processes, and not immediate, the same way that Einstein stood with Hubble, saw Hubble's data and realized he was wrong, and he immediately changed his mind. Religion doesn't work like that. So when somebody says that evolution is a religion, or a religious idea, or the Big Bang is a religious idea, it's simply not the case. If a better model came along right now that supplanted what we understand about the development of life and how changes in our genetic code have happened over time, if a superior model were produced, we would abandon our previous line of reasoning that we currently hold right now right away. There might be some resistance, but as long as the results stayed credible, we would accept it. When Einstein produced special relativity in 1905, there were already experiments that were calling into question a lot of things about classical mechanics and classical electrodynamics. But when he produced the idea of special relativity and produced the entire cohesive theory of it, it did not take long for physicists to latch onto it and realize the implications of the theory, and started testing them right away, and those tests started coming back in favor of the theory, and it was very quickly adopted. And so that's exactly how the Big Bang was accepted. That's exactly how evolution was accepted. Once scientists started to read Lemaitre's and Hubble's work and Darwin's work and realize the implications and start testing them and start making observations, they were quickly adopted. And if we find one tomorrow, we will abandon those ideas in favor of any better model. And that's simply not how religion works. Religion works by saying, I am correct and there is no better model. Even if that model changes over time, that is the sentiment of religion. So the Big Bang and evolution are not religions, but that's getting off track. So let me read from this passage. And while I do, once again, think about what this means for the framework in which science and religion may be compatible and don't really require any sort of reconciliation. So Lange says, "What mean these days? Says the great Father Augustine, long before geology was born. these strange sunless days? Does the enumeration of days and nights avail for a distinction between the nature that is not yet made, not yet formed or brought into form, and those which are made, so that they should be called morning and evening? He goes on to say, their true nature cannot be told. Hence they're called days as the best symbol by which the idea could be expressed. They're God-divided days and nights, in distinction from the sun-divided. Common solar days, he says, in reference to Augustine, are mere changes in the positions of the heavenly bodies, and not evolutions in nature belonging to a higher chronology, and marking their epochs by law of inward change instead of incidental outward measurements. As to how long or how short they were, he gives no opinion, but contents himself with maintaining that day is not a name of duration. The evenings and mornings are to be regarded not so much in respect to the passing of time as to their marks, or as to their marking the boundaries of a period to the passage of time. Carrying along with us these thoughts of the Great Father, we get a modern exegesis which is most satisfactory in and of itself, and which need not fear the assaults of any science. It transcends science. It cannot have any collision with it, and can therefore never have any need for what is called reconciliation. It treats of origins or beginnings in nature, things to which science can never reach. It is a mode of exegesis most satisfactory, as being most inclusive. That is, from the very nature of the things related, based directly on the account itself, and mainly, necessarily, self-interpreting. Notions in science, notions in philosophy, or in theology that stand outside of it, and even etymologies or modes of naming that become fixed in language at later periods may suggest ideas, but they're not to control the interpretation of a document so isolated from all other writings and of such exceeding antiquity. The most clear and direct is found in the fourth commandment, Exodus 20:11. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. This language is held to be conclusive evidence of the latter having been ordinary days. They're of the same kind, it is said, or they would not have been put in such immediate connection. There could not be such a sudden change in rise or in the meaning. This looks plausible, but a careful study shows that there is something more than first strikes us. It might be replied that there is no difference of radical idea, which is essentially preserved and without any metaphor in both uses, but a vast difference in the scale. There is, however, a more definite answer specifically by the text itself, and suggested immediately by the objector's own method of reasoning. God's days of work, it is said, must be the same with man's day of working, because they're mentioned in such close connection. Then God's work and man's work must also be the same, or on the same grade for a similar reason. The Hebrew word is the same for both. In 6 days thou shalt in 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. Is there no transition to a higher idea? And so of the resting? The seventh shall be to thee a Sabbath. For the Lord thy God rested on the seventh day. Words of the same general import, but the less solemn or more human term here applied to deity. What a difference there must have been between God's work and man's work. Above all, between God's ineffable repose and the rest demanded for human weariness. Must we not carry the same difference into the times and make a similar ineffable distinction between the divine working days and the human working days, the God-divided days, as Augustine calls them, and the Son-divided days afterwards appointed to us for signs and for seasons, and for days and for years, of our lower chronology? Such a pointing to a higher scale is represented in the septennial Sabbath and in the great Jubilee period of 7 times 7. They expand upwards and outwards like a series of concentric circles, but the greatest of them is still a sign of something greater. And how would they all collapse and lose their sublime import if we regard their antitype as less than themselves, or in fact no greater than at least? The other analogy, instead of being forced, has at its highest reason. It is the true and effective order of contemplation. The lower, or earthly day, is made a memorial of the lighter. We are called to remember it. In the 6 human days do all thy work, for in 6 divine days the Lord made heaven and the earth. The juxtaposition of the words and the graduated correspondence which the mind is compelled to make aid the reminiscence of the higher idea. An arc of a degree on the small earthly scale represents a vastly wider. Hang on just a second, I apologize. An arc of a degree on the small earthly scale represents a vastly wider arc as measured on the celestial sphere. A sign of our swiftly passing times corresponds to one ineffably greater in the higher chronology of world movements, where one day is 1,000 years, and the years are reckoned from olam to olam. I think about words like these, and it's in this framework that I exist. And I don't want to, once again, fall into the danger of argument from authority, right? I mentioned this in the last video. Argument from authority says person A or source A or whatever is an expert, and therefore what they say must be true. But that's not the intent here. My intent is for folks to think through if somebody has dedicated their life to studying something the way that Lange did scripture, right? He wrote an entire commentary from Genesis through Revelation, and it's sitting on my shelf. I inherited it from my dad. Still living. He just gave me his set of commentaries. Someone who produced a work on the Bible so expansive and so explanatory and in depth behooves us to at least consider what he's saying. Doesn't mean that he's right. Doesn't mean that Augustine was right. But it does compel us to ask the question, if they have studied much more than I, what conclusions are they coming to? And should I think through those same conclusions as well? Doesn't mean you have to accept the conclusions, but you should think through them. And that is also what I would say regarding the scientific method. When a consensus emerges in science, it doesn't necessarily mean that that consensus is correct. We've had many instances where the scientific consensus turned out to be wrong. And the scientific consensus was falsified through further and later experiment. The eternal universe is an example of that. Most astronomers believed that the universe was eternal in the 1800s and up into the early 1900s. And their consensus was wrong, right? The consensus was simply wrong. There was a consensus regarding how light should behave from perfect emitters. And initially, a lot of modeling and data showed that there was a specific pattern that the data and that the data followed, and that data was, or the pattern was predictable from a model. But it turned out that further experimentation into different regimes of light upended that model. So there was an initial consensus about how black body light behaved, and then it had to be overturned later. So we never want to say that, just because person A is a scientist, they must be correct, or person B or group B are scientists, they must be correct. What we do urge is to accept the idea that if there are people with more expertise, that their opinion be counted more. That's what science is.